Are we okay to start? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to American Institutes for Research. We're so excited to host you here today. My name is Angela Minichi. I'm the director of AIR's Education Policy Center, and we're really committed to bringing evidence and research into policy discussions, and that's why we're so excited to host this conversation today about some of the most pressing English language learner issues, particularly with the passage of the new legislation, the Every Student Succeeds Act. So I have the pleasure of introducing my good friend and colleague, Diane August. And Diane, I think many of you know her work. She has been working in English language learner issues for over 40 years. Is that correct, Diane? And Diane's been extremely prolific. She just actually wrote a blog for us on the Education Policy Center website that actually looks at some of the major changes from No Child Left Behind to ESSA as it regards English language learners. So if you are not part of if you don't follow us, we'll have an opportunity for you to see our Twitter feed, but you can go right to our website where we have that blog. And just yesterday was a co-author on a report looking at dual language programs across the United States. So I'd like to take this time to introduce Diane, and also to really welcome. I know we have some people here that are here in person for the event, but we have a really large live streaming audience. So I wanted to welcome those people who are joining us remotely for this really important conversation. One last thing before Diane comes up. After our conversation today, we do have a reception where you'll be able to talk to some of the amazing experts you're going to hear from today. People like Diane August and Kenji Hakuta and Jen O'Day are also here too, so it'll be a great opportunity for you to really talk to some of the people that are doing some of the most important research in the field. So with that, Diane.
Thanks so much, Angela, and welcome everyone. We're really glad to see you, and welcome the people who happen to be online. As the program notes, the event is sponsored also by the Working Group on EL Policy, and you can find policy information related to English learners at our website, which is ellpolicy.org. So that's ellpolicy.org. The briefing's also sponsored by the Center for English Language Learners at the American Institutes for Research. Center staff are involved in a variety of activities related to English learners. We do research related to teaching and learning. We do evaluation research. We do policy relevant work, as well as provide technical assistance to states and districts on all matters English learner. I'd like to talk a little bit about who these folks are. They're going to introduce themselves briefly, but who they are and how they're supported. The support for the fellows comes from their institutions. The support also comes from the institutions of what we're calling the senior fellows. So the senior fellows are three of us are here. Me, my colleagues Kenji Hakuta, Jennifer O'Day, Patricia Gandara from UCLA, and Robert Linquanti from West Ed. And so we all started getting worried that we needed to sort of encourage the next generation of researchers who do policy work in the EL space. And we're fortunate enough to get funding from the Spencer Foundation and from our institutions to bring together these policy fellows for the course of this year. And we've worked together to help people get to know each other, to have policy relevant conversations, and to have events like this one, where we were at the Senate this morning, briefing the Senate, and have opportunities here to talk with folks from researchers, practitioners in the area, as well as people who do policy relevant work. So how we're going to organize this is we're going to have two panels. I'm going to moderate the first panel, and Kenji will moderate the second panel. We have the first panel is focused on accessing core content for English learners, and also focused on how can we best assess these children to support learning. There'll be 5 panelists, and there'll be some discussion after there's some Q&A. The second panel that Kenji will chair is focused on teacher quality and increasing the supply of qualified teachers. So I'm not going to take up any more time now. So could the folks on the first panel come and sit down? So I'm going to let you get settled for a minute, catch your breath, and don't fall off the podium. Looks like tight quarters up there. Okay, so as I mentioned, the first panel is really focused on access to core content and also access to meaningful assessments. But before we start, I'd like everyone just to say their name and their affiliation, and then I'll start with some questions. So Mikyung, do you want to start?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Mikyung Wolf, and I'm from ETS, Educational Testing Service.
Hi, my name is Jim Soland, and I'm from Northwest Evaluation Association.
And I'm Claudia Rodriguez Mojica at Santa Clara University.
Michael Kiefer, New York University.
Rebecca Callahan, University of Texas, Austin.
Okay, so we've generated these questions as a group because they're very policy relevant and they really draw on the expertise of the panel. So the first question Claudia is going to answer, and it is, what do we know about research-based practices that give English language learners access to core content?
Thank you, Diane. So to answer that question, I'm just going to take a step back for just a few seconds. The first and most important thing is that our English learners have to be in classes where they are having core content, right? Where core content is being taught. After that, it's more than just placing students in science classes, math classes, even AP classes. We have to make sure that teachers are using instructional modification so that students are able to actually understand and use the information that is given to them. We call these instructional modifications scaffolds, right? So if we think of them as structures that teachers use in order to allow students to gain access to the content. And also remember, English learners come at a wide range of English language proficiency levels. Some English learners might understand little to no English, but others might actually be able to understand quite a bit of English that this teacher is using and is able to produce them themselves, just at varying levels. So when we think about scaffolds or how teachers might modify what they're doing in the classroom, we use a lot of different strategies, some of them with more research support than others. Some of the ones we used do not have any research support. So I'll highlight some that do have research support behind them. And these are, one of the strategies is modeling skills, strategies, or concepts. So when you're teaching, you're actually showing students how to do something, right? You give them the information and you actually go through it and show them exactly what it is that you're doing. Also, building background knowledge. Our students come from a lot of different backgrounds, and we can't just assume that they'll understand what we're talking about, right? If we're talking about castles, if we're talking about anything else that the students might not really engage with at home or talk about these different things, we want to give them access to that and give them more information. Providing wait time. If we ask questions of students, pausing for about 3 or 4 seconds so that the students have a chance to process that question and be able to develop a response without somebody else that knows the answer right away going in and answering the question. Now, there's also other things, like I mentioned, that we do that we actually don't have research for yet. These are things like content and language objectives. We have research behind content objectives, but it's really at the college level. Language objectives are used a lot in our classrooms, but we really don't yet know if they actually help students. We think they might because they focus instruction and students know what they will be learning, but we just don't have that research yet. Another thing are sentence frames or sentence starters, right? So we might ask a question and tell students, say something like, I think, ... because. We do this because we want students to have an entry point to the conversation, but we really have no research behind these. And that isn't to say that no research means that they're bad, right? Or that they won't help students. We just simply don't know that they will help students yet. So when we use sentence frames or sentence starters, for instance, it requires that teachers really be thoughtful and think about whether or not the particular sentence frame or sentence starter will help the students. Is it actually answering the question we want them to answer? Because sometimes we give them sentence starters and they're not at all related to what it is that we're trying to get them to answer. So being very thoughtful about these things and also raising awareness about what we have research about and what we just do not. And again, highlighting that no research does not mean that they do not work. It just means that we don't have the research evidence behind it to be able to say these work with English learners.
Thank you. That was a great answer. I use sentence starters and sentence frames and all the scaffolding we do, cognizant of the fact that I'm pretty sure they work, but they really haven't been tested out as a particular kind of support. It would be an important thing to do. And your point is really well taken about there are all kinds, it's sort of the devil's in the detail with all this work. So it can be done really well and it could be done really poorly. And a lot of people don't know the difference. It just looks like words until they try it out with kids. So thanks for that great 3-minute presentation. This is a lot of information to pack into very little time here. This is a real challenge. Okay, so Michael's going to talk about what we know about high-quality elementary and middle grade literacy instruction, and I think partly from the perspective of his participation in a panel convened by the Department of Education to look very carefully at the research that examined effective instruction for English learners.
Thanks, Diane. So as Diane mentioned, I had the honor to serve on a panel organized by the Department of Education to put together what's called a What Works Clearinghouse Practice Guide for teaching English learners. What this meant was that we reviewed research that had used experimental or quasi-experimental designs to look at some of the evidence for what we know works and under what conditions and sort of what ways, but also to try to translate that research into more practical and kind of actionable recommendations. In some sense, we were limited to not be able to kind of take a wider view of research in some ways. But at the same time, I think the recommendations that we've produced actually are broad, at least to an extent have some breadth. So to just briefly talk about those 4 recommendations that emerged from the panel, the first was around teaching academic vocabulary in a robust way. And what I mean by this is that this is not teaching decontextualized lists of words and their definitions, what we too often continue to see in classrooms, but rather teaching words and academic vocabulary as a way of building concepts, building new conceptual knowledge, and teaching words as tools to be used for particularly important communicative purposes. So for the purposes of making an argument in a particular discipline, for the purposes of being able to access sophisticated text in the content areas. The second recommendation is to and I think echoes what we've heard already from Claudia about integrating oral and written language instruction into content area teaching. So this means thinking about content and language and the relationships between those in richer and deeper ways than we have in the past. So rather than just thinking about language as this medium through which we teach content, so let's find ways to make language simpler or make the language more transparent to somehow get to the content, which is an approach that people have sort of thought about or used in the past, but rather how do we think about the language of the content area as part of the instruction, as part of what we're helping students be able to do. If we're trying to help students make an argument in a social studies classroom, what is the language that's required to do that successfully? What are the language practices and skills that go into that? And how do we scaffold their ability to acquire those? The third recommendation is around writing and the notion of providing more regular and structured opportunities to develop written language skills. So with English language learners, as with many students in the US over the last few decades, we've had such a push toward reading and that we are seeing in some observational studies that there's very little time devoted to writing. This is a problem, I think, for all students, but for English learners who need to develop productive language skills, this lack of opportunities to do so is a real challenge and a real problem, I think. So to find ways to provide more opportunities to do that through writing. And then finally, to provide small group instructional intervention to those students who are having persistent struggles in areas of literacy or English language development. So what this means is thinking about intervention in more thoughtful ways than it has been in the past, thinking about English learners as a really diverse and heterogeneous population. So rather than every student who's classified as an English learner getting some particular intervention, thinking about, well, what are students struggling with in particular areas? So a student who is been in the U.S. for several years and had a couple of years of instruction and is still struggling with sounding out and decoding English words will need a very different type of intervention than a student who is struggling with reading comprehension. And to think about how to match students more appropriately to those interventions, and to think about making sure that there are opportunities for students to have targeted and short-term intervention, but also minimize the time in which they'd be in any kind of homogeneous grouping. So all of those recommendations, I think, as Dan mentioned, the devil's in the details here. So these are broad kinds of ideas. The implementation of this requires a lot of capacity building. And I think part of what we tried to do with the guide was not just create the guide to be a tool that could be used for helping teachers understand this with practical examples, but folks have also began to create a number of ancillary materials. So there's a guide to teacher working groups where teachers can work together to start to think about how to implement these activities. So if folks are interested in that, they can actually just Google practice guide in English learners, and you should be able to find it pretty quickly. You could also Google me and go through my website. Thanks.
Thanks so much. That report, I think, made a real contribution to the field by laying out that framework and providing really great examples of how the recommendations could be effectively instantiated in practice. So now Rebecca is going to talk to us about what we know about school structures, programming, things like programming, teacher and administrator beliefs, and how these impact content learning for English learners. So it's sort of at a different level, but also very important things to consider when we talk about effective schooling.
And I'll be building off of Claudia and Michael's work here. And when we think about English learners and their access to, get closer to the mic. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we think about English learners' access to academic content, as Claudia mentioned, first we need to make sure the students are even getting into those classes. And then as Michael mentioned, we need to know what's happening, what kind of activities, what kind of engagement English learner students have when they are in these content area classes, what kind of instruction they're reading. And what I like to think of as an overinterpretation of policy, we find that at the secondary level, very often many English learners, because of the EL status, are precluded from access and entry into that college preparatory coursework. We don't know exactly why this happens. We can hypothesize that it may be educators and administrators worry that we need to make sure they're in an ESL program. We don't know that we have an EL certified teacher who can teach chemistry. We need to make sure the students, that may be what's happening. We don't know that for certain yet, but we do know that for a large group of EL students that their access is limited based on that EL label that they're given. We also know that it's not for all EL students, that we see benefits to EL placement for the most recent immigrants and the least English proficient students at the secondary level, the students who most well fit that English learner profile. So we know that there are issues about access there too, that this EL placement is actually helpful in making sure they're in the right math classes and getting access to the content. The next level of this, however, is what happens in these classrooms. And we talk about access to instruction and meaningful discussion. And far too often we see that, especially for secondary ELs, they're in classes which are drill and memorization rather than classes where they're negotiating meaning. We don't see a lot of inquiry-based science for the EL population. We're not seeing a whole lot of the rich discussion that lends towards the building of an academic vocabulary, which is exactly what our students need. And especially when we're looking at a bilingual, largely immigrant English learner population, either immigrants themselves or children of immigrants, we know that bilinguals have cognitive, psychosocial advantages in adulthood. That literature is very clear. So we would think that they would have an advantage in the K-12 system. And we also know that children of immigrant parents have what we call the immigrant, Cow and Tienda's work on the immigrant advantage. Immigrant parents hold very high expectations for their children. And when we control on all else, race, ethnicity, and the kitchen sink, we find that children of immigrant parents often do perform better. What we have found most recently, however, is that for those secondary children of immigrant parents in ESL placement during high school, they do not experience the same returns on that rich academic content, even if they get into advanced math and that pre-calculus or calculus, that advanced math course taking, we find that they don't experience the same returns on that placement. It does not give them that boost in college going. It does not boost their entry into four-year institutions like it does for other children of immigrant parents, other bilinguals who are simply not in that EL placement during high school. So we need to be teasing apart the access issues here. Another question that's come into play is, what do teachers expect in these classrooms of their EL populations? And we find that in the literature, children of immigrant parents, the teachers often report that they're very hard workers. And they report that they make great effort, which is wonderful. But they also expect that they expect less of them. They're less likely to expect that they will go to college. They're less likely to expect that they will succeed academically and excel academically. So the students, and there's also research that suggests that children of immigrant parents, underrepresented groups may be more sensitive to teachers' expectations as well. So they're internalizing this message that they're doing well because they're really, really hard workers. But poor you, we don't think you'll actually go as far in the academic pipeline. So they're getting this mixed message, and that may also be contributing to some of these truncated academic pathways that we're seeing. So there are several structural pieces in place in terms of abiding with policy and making sure that everyone's in compliance. And there are also, I think, some societal beliefs about language and student expectations that also contribute to some of the challenges we have in ensuring that EL students access academic content.
Okay, thank you very much. So again, another important point about the importance of thinking about the individual attributes of these students in how you place them, where sort of a focus on ESL may be appropriate for kids at certain levels of proficiency, but you might want to think more about integrating ELs at intermediate and more advanced levels of proficiency in heterogeneous classrooms that include second language, that include monolingual English speakers. So thanks a lot. We're gonna turn now to meaningful assessments, and Jim's gonna talk about how important it is to measure attitudinal and other non-cognitive outcomes for English learners and some of the measurement challenges in measuring these types of outcomes.
Thanks so much. And I feel like the question really dovetails nicely with what Rebecca was just talking about, which is this idea of the richness of the educational experience for English learners and the challenges associated with that. So I think it can be really important to measure some of these attitudinal pieces with English learners because we spend a lot of time seeing how they react to policies in terms of achievement, but we don't spend as much time thinking about how they react to things emotionally, attitudinally, aspirationally, and all of those things are really caught up in how they achieve. And so the information, in my experience, can be really useful both for comparing ELs to non-ELLs, but also comparing current English learners to former English learners. So as most people in this room know, an English learner gets to a point where the district or school may reclassify them. And at that point, they're deemed sort of not to need the English learner supports and services that they needed previously. And so I've started looking at how the aspirations, college aspirations, and some of these pieces relate for students who have not been reclassified to those who have just been reclassified. And even making these comparisons in cases for students who just barely met the criteria for reclassification to those who just barely failed to meet those criteria. So like really, really comparable students. Whether you're classified as an English learner or a reclassified English learner can really impact things like whether or not you plan on going to college, whether you feel supported in the process of going to college, and also just if you feel ready for the academic content. So we can sort of see that an English learner who's been reclassified can handle academic content by looking at their test scores, but it's another thing to say that they think it's really within their wheelhouse to do well. And the second half of the question is a really big one, I think, which is what are the measurement challenges? And just to provide a very small sliver related to that, I think computers are really changing how you assess some of these things. And just a couple quick examples. So in the case of something like problem solving, instead of just assessing a kid by having them interact with another peer who knows what you're going to get. You might get paired with me, and that would be really rough for you and your results. But now you can interact with sort of a standardized computer avatar. And another case that I've been looking at a lot is in computer adaptive tests, you actually get really good information about whether or not a student has engaged with a test question, or if they've looked at it, been overwhelmed, and just moved through it faster than would have been necessary to actually take in some of the content. And you can learn a lot from these measures, both about in terms of how a kid reacts to a test, but also in terms of how engaged they are with the academics. And as a final example of how sort of this non-cognitive piece, this attitudinal piece and academics relate, I've done some work looking at achievement gaps where you factor in how hard a kid has tried on the test, and they can change pretty radically when you look at some of these things. So all really wrapped up in one form or another.
Okay, thank you so much. So we're going to go on to Mick Young, the last person on the panel, who's going to talk about how teachers can use various assessment results to support EL's development of academic language and literacy. And we're going to, as soon as Mick Young's done, we're going to open it up to the audience for some questions before we go on to the next panel.
Thank you, Diane. So many of you know that states are using summative English language proficiency ELP assessment to measure English learners' language proficiency. Those summative statewide ELP assessment is give you some idea about what kind of language skills that ELs would need at the very macro level. And remember, this is only one time that we are measuring students' language proficiency. But today, actually, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the different types of assessment that may be more actually meaningful at the classroom level, which is a formative assessment. I just had very recently, we had a multi-year research project working on formative assessment for middle school English learners to help the teachers and students to develop the academic reading skills. And some of the findings from that research project is that there is some disconnect between the teacher's knowledge about formative assessment and an actual enactment of a formative assessment in classroom in a meaningful way. So formative assessment, just by definition, is supposed to allows teachers to have ongoing minute-by-minute assessment during the instructional process to identify the students' needs and also adapt their instruction, right, in real time based on all the collected evidence, and then use that for their next time instruction. So by definition, formative assessment has a potential benefit for the English learners who have such a wide range of English proficiency. So as Michael said, some long-term ELs who are born in the U.S. and have a good command of conversational skills might be struggle with some academic literacy skills, Whereas we may have some newcomers who just came to the U.S., just new to the American culture, and speak very little English. Those two different types of group of ELs are teachers who need to identify what kind of difficulties they have and to access the content learning and also adapt their instruction depending on those students' needs. So our research also finding suggests that but there is a lack of sound materials that EL teachers can use for formative purposes. The most materials that are out there to help the students to develop academic language skills are more geared to just the mainstream students. But given that such a wide range of English proficiency levels, it seems there is a critical need for to support teachers to provide the sound materials that are specifically designed for English learners to help to develop their academic language skills to have access to core content learning.
Okay, thanks so much. So again, I think it's helping teachers understand what formative assessments are, that they're not, a different kind of summative assessment in a sense, but a way to interact with children minute to minute to get a better understanding of what their language and literacy skills are, and also to respond to them in appropriate ways. We spend a lot of time talking about what teachers should do, like how they should instruct, and a lot less time thinking about how teachers in real time should respond to English learners' language to help support that. So a really interesting point you made. So I'm going to take just 5 minutes or so of questions from the audience because we're trying to end on time here. And if you have a question, if you could state it very briefly and address it to a particular panelist, we'll have just time for a couple questions. And could you state your name and your affiliation also? And maybe stand up. Lots of requirements here. Sorry, this will probably be the last person that answers a question as a result of this, but go ahead.
Claudia Sanchez, I'm with National Public Radio. Why does the research lag so far behind practice? I mean, it almost seems as if your findings, as notable as they are essentially shared in an echo chamber, and that they never get to the practitioners, to the teachers who need this information. What gets in the way of that?
Yeah, go ahead, Claudia.
So I'll let others respond to if they would like to, but I think one reason, right, you said, why does research lag so far behind practice? That was actually one of the questions that led me to graduate school and to study this, because I was in the classroom, I had to do something, right? And I felt like I had to figure out a way or really learn what research was out there. But I think one answer to your question is that as teachers, we have to be creative and in the moment try to design ways to support our students, English learners, and all of the other needs that are in the classroom. So a lot of the ways research reacts to what teachers are doing already, and then we try to figure out whether or not it's actually working, right? We definitely come up with ideas and recommendations, but it doesn't always start at the research level. Teachers, on the spot, if any of you are teachers, you've likely done this, right? On the spot, your student is struggling. Right then and there, you have to figure out a way to be able to support the student. So then again, on the part of researchers, then we try to connect with that practice and try to figure out, is this working? And it's not as easy as, is it working or not? But if it's not, what modifications, what little changes might we be able to make? Or maybe is it working with some English learners that are maybe struggling more and not with the ones that are more high achieving?
Okay, so Jennifer, did you want to say something? No, I have a question. Oh, you have a question? Okay. I'll tell you what, I'll give one other person a chance to say something really briefly, okay? Because I'd like to get a couple more questions from the audience. So did somebody else want to say something quickly?
Very, very briefly. I think there are a number of reasons why research doesn't get into practice. We do need to look at what incentives we have for teachers to further their education. How well do we support teachers getting a master's degree? How well do we support professional development for our in-service teachers? And I think when we think about this particular population of English learners, they're immigrant, they're very often children of color, very often living in poverty. We have their language minority, they speak other languages at home. We have some societal beliefs about language that don't always bend despite the research. We present the research findings over and over. We know there are cognitive, psychological, social, problem-solving benefits to bilingualism, and that is a hard sell. And we expect our students to learn English sooner rather than later.
So there is a point that there is research that doesn't inform practice, and then there's a lot of practice that needs to be more carefully studied to see how well it applies to different populations of English learners. I think the department is making a huge effort to make our research more practical and to try to do research studies that don't take 3 years to get findings out to the field. So I have people from IES here who could talk about that. You might want to talk with them after at the cocktail party, because I know they're making a big effort in this area. Any other questions? Yes. Could you say your name?
I have a bad knee. I'm not going to stand.
Okay, but maybe your name.
My name is Roberta Stanley, and I'm a K-12 public education advocate. Our country, the Syrian episode notwithstanding, has been very accepting of refugees and immigrants from all over the world. I'm just wondering how well served certain sectors of these families are. And for example, I'd like to point out Mideasterners. I'm wondering if we're really serving those families and pupils to the extent we should be.
I'm not, are any of you prepared to answer that?
I didn't mean to.
Oh, no, that's okay. No, that's all right.
I happen to be from Michigan. I come from a very rural town, and a bunch of folks from Yemen came there. All of a sudden, they're 10% of the community. That's 10,000 people. I mean, 1,000 people out of the 10,000.
Right.
I know the school district was reluctant to acknowledge whatever, and I worked for the State Department of Ed, so I forced them to be responsive by way of Dearborn to get a bilingual instructor in there. But you know, there are pockets like that all over the United
Yes,
States.
definitely. So, you know, the next panel is going to talk about increasing the supply of teachers prepared to teach English learners. And they're also going to talk about improving teacher capacity. And so one issue, of course, is making sure that we have teachers that understand how to support English language learners, but also have some understanding of the cultural background of these students. So hopefully someone will talk about pipeline issues. Jen.
Jennifer O'Day from AIR. So we've been talking about access to content, and one of the things, the context in which that is happening right now, is a shift in most states to much more ambitious standards. I was wondering if you could say something about how you see both the opportunities and the challenges of that shift.
Okay, in 2 minutes. Brief, okay.
I can make a comment about that. I mean, yeah, I think, so one of the opportunities is that by virtue of the standards being more ambitious, part of what they're doing is, in some ways at least, asking students to do more meaningful things than they used to be asked to do. So some of the prior generation of standards was asking students to do things that were much more kind of disconnected pieces of language. Now, students are asked to do these things that are more sophisticated and challenging, but with that, they're also more meaningful. So there's these opportunities for actually improving, for our English learners to actually have more access to the kinds of things that they might be better suited to do well in some ways, right? So an example, I have a colleague who studies science education talking about the next generation science standards, and that the next generation science standards have such a focus on things like making arguments in science as opposed to learning kind of facts and memorization in science, that shift actually could be really beneficial for English learners, because it means that it forefronts the role of these scientific practices, which are all linguistic practices, like making an argument. And that move actually is a real benefit because it puts language kind of at the forefront and meaningful uses of language at the forefront. So to me, that's an opportunity. It's not just a matter that these standards are harder and higher, and thus English learners are that much further from them. I think that's a false way to think about it. I think it's a better way to think about it that actually, in some ways, these standards are asking our students to do, and certainly our teachers to think about teaching in new ways, and there are challenges there, but there also are opportunities because they're also asking us to do things that are bringing the relationship between sort of language and content in more meaningful ways.
Okay, so I'm going to stop this panel now. We're going to have, because we really need to give the other panel equal time, equal opportunity. And And all the fellows, we're going to have a cocktail afterwards. All the fellows are going to be here. We're going to be here, and we encourage you to come and just ask us any questions you have, and we can actually elaborate further. Okay? So I want to thank you all very much. Did a great job. So while the next panel is getting ready, I want to introduce my colleague Kenji Hakuta, who is a professor at Stanford and has been very involved in EL education and policy work for quite a while. He is going to come moderate this panel.
Tight quarters here. Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Kenji Hakuta, and I wanted to start by thanking Diane and Angela at AIR. Both their centers of policy and ELLs have just been terrific collaborators, and I now know that, if we have an idea and we talk about it, watch out because it'll get done. And here we are doing this panel together. We also had a wonderful experience this morning at the Senate with a staff briefing, and it's just a great set of experiences that I think will start making some more of those connections that between practice and research, as well as policy and research, and bringing those together. So this panel is really about teacher quality and the pipeline, how to improve its efficiency, basically effectiveness in recruiting and training and supporting teachers. And we have a great set of folks. And one of the things I would like to say about many of them is that, education is a field in which the researchers often come to it out of an experience of having taught or having, it's a very, very personal kind of experience. And then many of them come and get PhDs, which are research degrees, and end up in institutions of higher education where they're, again, training the next generation of teachers. So I think you'll hear some of that perspective on this panel as well. So the first question is for Luis Posa about the characteristics of effective teachers, thinking about the recruitment and development of effective teachers for ELs. What research-based practices and characteristics should policymakers be targeting? That's a sentence frame, by the way. Anyway, blank.
Thank you, Kenji. So I'm Luis Posa. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Colorado, Denver. And so a number of research reports from different organizations, the University of California Linguistic Minority Research Institute, the National Clearinghouse of English Language Acquisition, work by Guadalupe Valdez at Stanford University and her colleagues, Tamara Lucas and Ana Maria Villegas around linguistically responsive teaching. All this kind of comes together to highlight 5 key dispositions and skills and knowledge bases that teachers have who are effective with English learners. So first, they have a strong knowledge of theories of language development and language acquisition, including this understanding that language varies across and within social and academic contexts. Second, they have favorable dispositions towards their English learner students, right? So this is an appreciation that their linguistic resources, their home languages, their home cultures and cultural practices are assets that can be leveraged for learning rather than deficits that interfere with it. Thirdly, they have a familiarity with the pedagogical practices that you heard Michael and Claudia speak to in the previous panel as well. So they have this understanding of pedagogical practices that help students use language for authentic purposes across domains. And what I mean by that is listening, reading, speaking, and writing. Fourth, they have an ability and a willingness to engage with students' families. And then fifth, they have high feelings of self-efficacy in their own ability to do these things, right? And so then in terms of generating, nurturing these skills or dispositions, research, actually some work by Megan Hopkins right here, and another study by Lopez Lopez, Scanlon, and Gundrum from 2013, highlights some of the ways that we can start to ensure these dispositions. And my colleagues will speak more to particular pathways, but Megan's work points to really the value of bilingual teachers. So teachers who are themselves bilingual in students' languages tended to engage these practices more frequently and had more favorable dispositions towards these practices. Likewise, both studies found that teachers who had received certification specifically designed for working with English learner students also had more favorable positions about these practices and were more likely to engage them as well.
All that in the context of all kinds of constraints, the labor force, the time frame in which this teacher education has to be done, all of the other things around teaching in addition to the things that he mentioned that new teachers are expected to learn. And so it's clearly an uphill battle, but incredibly helpful to have these elements defined. So the next question I have is for Anne-Marie, and I should just note that Anne-Marie is actually the only fellow that we have whose focus is on higher education. She's a national resource really especially around access to Hispanic serving institutions. She teaches in one herself, at UT San Antonio. And anyway, Anne-Marie, so how do we get more qualified teachers into the pipeline?
So I want to take up. Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Great. So I want to take up Luis's point about Megan Hopkins' research about the effectiveness of encouraging more bilingual teachers to enter the profession. And so one of the key points along the pipeline is having more bilingual students and English learner students go to college. So overall, English learner students are less likely to go to college than other English learner high school graduates are less likely to go to college than other students. But if they score as English proficient, they have equivalent college-going outcomes. They go to similar kinds of institutions, and they graduate from college at similar rates as their monolingual English counterparts. So that underscores the importance of high school preparation and the dispositions that teachers are coming in with, that these students have equal access to college preparatory courses, including Algebra 1 in middle school, which is often a gateway class, and to advanced mathematics in high school, which for any student has been shown to be the most important predictor of college completion. So in terms of, Luis has already talked about the importance of teachers bringing in dispositions, weaving in culturally relevant curricula that recognizes students' assets as bilingual speakers is really important. And they also, in my institution, which is the largest, I think we prepare the largest number of teachers in the state of Texas, which is a state that also has dual language programs. In terms of the faculty, the bilingual department the bilingual professors work very closely with the interdisciplinary learning and teaching professors. So the teaching scholars and the bilingual scholars work very closely together, and those elements are woven into the curriculum for teachers. Another really important issue is leadership. And so I'm in the Educational Leadership and Policy Studies department. And so a lot of my colleagues are studying issues like what are the qualities that principals have or bilingual teachers who move up in administration have to create supportive structures for teachers to enact, implement culturally relevant curricula, to enact really supportive dispositions for English learners.
Great, thank you. So Daphne, down the other end there, what do we currently know about the nature of teacher certification, especially for teachers who teach English learners?
Thank you. So I'd like to start off by highlighting the variability here as many of you know, states are the ones that are tasked with certifying teachers and other professional licensures. And so what that means is that the landscape looks different across states, even before the passage of ESSA, right, that is so state-focused. And so we know, for example, though, that over 30 states do not require ELL training for general classroom teachers beyond federal requirements. However, even in some of those states, there are some certification programs that are optional. And so just to give you a quick story, I went from being a teacher educator in one state, California, that had shifted to require all teachers to have some kind of state certification embedded for any teacher who was certified after roughly approximately 2003 to shifting to the Washington state context where it's optional. And what I have to say is that in Washington, actually, I think particularly at my institution at the University of Washington, I think we have we have more possibilities for what we can do because we're not constrained, ironically, to having to squeeze everything into the main credential. Even though, of course, in the main credential at the University of Washington, we ensure that all of our students have some background in English language learning issues. But it's also one thing you have to think about when you think of state licensure and certification is the variation that you have not only at the state level, but the variation that you have from our university, for example, to other models and other programs. And this is an area that is very dynamic and shifting, especially with the increase in alternative certification methods. And so this is definitely an area where I would want to see more research because this is a gateway. This is the certification is a floor you can think about, not a ceiling, but a floor to just think about what are the basic things that we want teachers to know and be able to do. And also there are state level competencies that speak to dispositions as well. What is the picture of what this looks like because of all the certification? The last thing that I want to say is that there's really a need for both general education teachers to have some certification as well as specialists. And what had happened in California when the system shifted from the ELL certification being optional to being required was that the requirements got really reduced because they had to squeeze into those programs. And so that's what happened when the law passed in 2001 and was later implemented. And so we need to make sure that as more states think about requiring ELL certification for all teachers, that we don't drop all of those requirements and that we still maintain some higher level training for those who really specialize in and want to get more training and learning to teach. And we need to ensure that the floor is not just doesn't become the ceiling, and that teachers are supported to grow and learn through professional development, quality professional development over time in their careers.
Thank you. Diego Roman moved from California, being a teacher in California, getting his degree, to Texas, where he's involved in a pre-service training program. And could you say a few words about characteristics of high-quality pre-service?
Yes, thank you, Kenji. So my name is Diego Roman. I am at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. I have a 5-year-old son who is in a dual language program. I'm trying to raise my son bilingual, as many of us are. So we are academically and emotionally invested in the high quality of bilingual education. In Dallas and in Texas and in many states, we have a need for bilingual teachers. There is, Dallas brings teachers from Spain, Mexico, Puerto Rico, who afterwards end up going back to their countries of origin or states of origin. And the state spends a lot of money or the districts spend a lot of money into recruiting these teachers, but not raising bilingual teachers from the bilingual population that we have in Texas. In Texas, Many of the schools, as far as I know, 70% of the Dallas Independent School District is Latino. So, but still we have a need for bilingual teachers. So there is something going on there. So then, in terms of high quality programs to prepare teachers to work with English learners, so we know that high quality field experiences are important. Those experiences have to be related to the practice of teaching. And I was remembering the question from the lady from Michigan. My wife is from Wisconsin, and I lived for many years in Wisconsin, and we have a big Hmong population. And many of the experiences that teachers get are not in the context in which they will be teaching next. So, for example, if there is a need to work with students from different countries who are coming as either refugees or immigrants, teaching experiences should be done in those contexts. We develop expertise in the context in which we work. So the other thing, there has to be a strong mentoring support. Districts have to have programs that support teachers as they are working with English learners. They are not going to figure that out on their own. There has to be some type of mentoring. The other thing is, and Luis, his research does a lot in this area, is this idea about the complexity of being bilingual, the dynamic nature of being a bilingual. So in class, for example, when Rebecca was saying, there is a power struggle also in what happens in the classroom, this social status of languages. We think that being a bilingual in German or French is better perhaps than being bilingual in Spanish or in another language. And then you negotiate your identity as a bilingual speaker in the classroom. And once you do that, there are some power dynamics happening among the students, among the student teacher, and getting at what teachers' ideologies are about language. What do we know about teacher attitudes towards specific languages, preparing them to do that, especially in the context when we bring teachers, monolingual speakers, let's say from other countries, who are not exposed, who weren't raised in a society as diverse as the United States. So all of those things. Then we do know, as Luis mentioned, that having some sort of certification in teaching English learners does make a difference in your effectiveness to work with English learners. And I will add that I work with science teachers specifically. In Texas, and perhaps Rebecca can speak more to this, we have a program called the Gomez and Gomez Dual Language Model, in which science is taught in Spanish, math is taught in English, right? So it's divided by subject area, and then you have Monday is English, Tuesday is Spanish, and so it's a complex model. Yeah, I'm still figuring it out coming from California. But what requires that is, for example, if I am a science teacher, right, or if I have to teach science, I have to have high knowledge or competency in science as a subject, plus the language competency. You have to know how to teach science in Spanish, which adds another level of complexity, the same with math in the other language. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Megan, who's already been quoted extensively by her colleagues, please quote yourself about professional development for in-service teachers.
Actually reading my work. It's great. Good afternoon. My name is Megan Hopkins. So most of us in this room probably know that the majority of teachers of English learners feel unprepared to do that work, right? And a recent survey of teachers related to implementing the Common Core standards showed that teachers of English learners among all teachers feel the least prepared to implement them with their students. So why is that? Well, as we've already heard, most teachers, a lot of teachers who are already in the teaching profession may have not received any training related to English learners in their pre-service preparation. Those are relatively new regulations in many states, and many states don't have regulations related to teaching English learners at the pre-service level. But we also know that in-service teachers most receive fewer than 8 hours of professional development related to teaching English learners, and the majority of that training is focused on narrow instructional strategies rather than using or building flexible repertoires of practices that teachers can use based on particular students' needs, and as we know, English learners' needs vary dramatically. So what would good professional development for teachers look like? And so I'm going to talk about two components, formal professional development and informal professional development. And they're separate but related and necessarily linked. So there are 5 components of effective professional development, generally, not just for teachers of English learners. The first is that it has a content focus. This is perhaps particularly important for English learners, and there's an opportunity with ESSA to think about this in terms of integrating language proficiency development into content area instruction and to think really critically about how to do that. So rather than training teachers in ESL and language development, thinking about how do you develop language in science and in mathematics and language arts and social studies, et cetera. It's also intensive and sustaining. So it lasts, professional development that lasts over a duration is better than the 8 hours of professional development you might get over a day in in-service training. The third component is collective participation among teachers. So teachers are actively engaged, and the fourth component is related, active learning. So it's not just you're sitting in a room and being talked at about the strategies that work, you're actively using them and looking at your curriculum and thinking how to modify it and talking with other teachers about how to do that, directly connected to your practice. And then the fifth component is that there's coherence. So you don't just go to a professional development that's not related to what you're doing in the classroom. It coheres with your curriculum. It coheres with who your students are. So that means that it's certainly not just somebody coming from the outside giving you some strategies. It's really embedded in your local context and in what you're doing in the classroom in terms of your curriculum and instruction. And so moving into thinking about informal learning opportunities, this is really important that it is linked to formal learning opportunities where teachers have opportunities to then go and think about with their colleagues, what does that mean for our practice in professional learning communities, which at the elementary level might be grade level teams, but at the high school might be content area teams. And what's really critical in EL education is that teachers who are experts in ESL and bilingual education are working with those content area teachers to make sense of instruction in the content areas. So again, supporting teachers to collaborate across language and content so that we're supporting our language learners in the content areas, and language isn't something that's kept separate, which is actually quite traditional in many schools. And so I wanted to end on talking about not surprisingly, the importance of bilingual and especially bilingually certified teachers in those professional learning communities. Because we know that bilingually certified teachers can actually be especially helpful in terms of being sources of advice and support for other teachers, and also brokers for families in the community. So not just linguistically, but cultural brokers, and in terms of shifting our frameworks around parent engagement, where it's not just parents come to the school and make copies for us, but we're actively working and going out into the community and working with parents and engaging them in ways that make sense for our local context. So getting to the question from the gentleman over here, thinking about why is there this research practice divide? Well, some of the most promising practices in professional development for English learners are being done through research practice partnerships, where researchers are working in school districts to think about how do we do this work. And so as an example, IES is funding a research practice partnership in Clark County with some folks at SRI International, and they're working directly with teachers to think about how do we integrate language proficiency into science at the elementary level, and what will that look like over time. So they're not just coming in to deliver strategies to teachers, they're actually working with teachers in the curriculum that they have and to think about how to do that in their specific context. And Kenji, as the last point, is also, Stanford has some Moocs, so another challenge would be, well, okay, that's well and good, but how do we get that on a large scale? So if we think about leveraging technology, Kenji and folks at Stanford are developing Moocs for teachers, and one of the ways that Seattle has been using these Moocs is with instructional coaches in the schools, where they're viewing the Moocs together and doing the activities in them, and then leveraging that to go into their practice and work with an instructional coach to develop their capacity to support language learners in the content areas.
Thank you. And Moocs, by the way, as a is an ugly acronym, but it stands for Massive Open Online Courses. They're the free online courses that are available. So we have, I'm going to do a time check here. How much time do we have for questions? 10 minutes. That's wonderful. Okay. So please do what Diane said. Stand up, identify yourself. Yes.
My name's Todd Wiggins. I'm impressed with your presentation. So I wanted to know if there's any new best practices that you've collectively learned since the age of the internet has developed that you would like to endorse that is different from what your parents would have learned, et cetera, about how you approach these tasks.
Certainly. Well, so as Diego mentioned, a lot of my research investigates kind of beliefs and attitudes about language. And I think one of the things that's really important is that we understand another reason why research and practice lag is that the research itself is also evolving and growing. And so one of the areas I would say where things are changing very rapidly is our understanding of what it even means to be bilingual. That's part of the impediment to getting bilingual children into the pipeline, into secondary, post-secondary, and teacher training is that their own bilingualism is seen as deficient because it doesn't adhere to sort of the monolingual Spanish paradigm of Spanish in Spain or things like that. And so what some of these new perspectives on recognizing how Spanish operates in a small Texas community, in a small San Francisco community, things like that, are letting us do is heighten and recognize the value of those Spanishes, those Englishes, those Tagalogs, and bring those into the classroom more effectively. To then also use those with modern telecommunication to foster conversations about how the language varies from one community to another and draw attention to those linguistic features and use those as learning points rather than stigmatizing one variety and prizing another. So I think that's a big part in helping teachers advance their own recognition of what it means to be bilingual and develop second languages and so on.
I'll just add to that. I think there are really important things that we're learning that might not be as visible, to speak to your question. I think the research has become a lot more sophisticated. And from what I've seen from my colleagues who do design, a kind of research called design-based research, often with partnerships, research, practice, partnerships, and collaborations, you have very sophisticated designs that are happening where instead of something being tried out in a lab somewhere, very sophisticated integration of systems. So sometimes in research, we think about the unit of analysis. Is it the teacher? Is it the student? And there's still a lot of those studies that do that. But I think just to try to convey, there's a lot of really sophisticated research that's looking at multiple levels and multiple units of analysis, schools, systems, networks, et cetera. And I think one thing that I've learned is also the significance of thinking beyond the individual teacher and really thinking about teacher communities, especially for their own development, as Megan was talking about. So I think that's one thing that we've learned.
Thank you. There's a question back there.
Hi, Grace Zamora Duran with the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs. You can probably guess my question. How do your programs prepare teachers to work with ELs with disabilities or who may be at risk of having disabilities?
Not very well. Honestly, I mean, it's an issue that I talk about at my institution quite a bit with the special education faculty because we're siloed, right? You know, we have special education endorsements, and that's an artifact of the way that we do our certifications at the state level, where you get a special education endorsement or you get an ESL endorsement. And often, if students are at the undergraduate level, they don't have time to do both. So something that we do as faculty is work to integrate that content. I teach a course on language assessment, and I integrate that content as that's quite important for using assessment and knowing how to read assessment results, so that you don't over or under identify language learners. But in my institution, it's really at the individual level because, I mean, it's a great question. Systematically, we really need to be thinking about how to do that better at the university level and all levels of the education system. I don't know if my colleagues have better examples, but.
Related to that question, earlier this morning, Karen Thompson from Oregon State presented some of the data from Oregon looking at the distribution of students who are English learners and also identified as disability. And the especially as you get into the middle school grades and older, the proportion of students who are still identified as an English learner overlaps significantly, so that it's more than 30%, I think, in some grades of students who are identified as English learner are English learner are also identified as having a disability, and so it really points to the importance of really addressing those students because they're very large numbers. Other questions?
What does the research say about gifted ELLs? How are they being treated?
Certainly. So I will say there are various elements to the research on giftedness and bilingualism. So certainly, I know the previous panel, Rebecca, spoke to the cognitive benefits, psycho-emotional benefits of bilingualism, and do the assessments that we administer for giftedness actually capture those things, right? And what we find is very often they don't, right? We don't recognize the extra work that bilingual kids do in their day-to-day life, cognitively, emotionally, socially, navigating those identities in those spaces. So what we would say is that bilingual children are underrepresented. I can't cite research, but I'm sure that would be the case, right? Is that they're underrepresented in that.
Yeah, and the other thing is that speaking English is not a requirement to be classified as gifted. But I don't know how many teachers know that, and if they have adequate measures of measuring giftedness that are not orally specific, right? That are not based on language production. So I think there is a lack of training for teachers to know about working with gifted English learners and how that is assessed, how that is measured, how to measure this diversity into the type of other signs of giftedness that they can show, how to take that into account. My son, for instance, he's attending this dual language program, and he missed the cut by 1 point. And I speak to him in Spanish. My wife speaks to him in English. And sometimes I think, would that be because he missed something that was related to language, or would so I don't know if that is captured. The bilingualism is captured by these assessments that measure for gifted students. So I think there is a lot of things to do to work in that area.
Yeah, can I just say that we're just starting a study now in Texas. We've created a survey. We're working with our partners down there in Texas from the RAL Southwest. We're doing a statewide survey in conjunction with the association that represents gifted and talented students. We're sending it out to every district in Texas, and we're collecting data about identification of children who are gifted. And we're looking specifically at English learners. So we're taking a pulse on what's happening in the state for all kids and then comparing that to what's happening with English learners, and it's quite a broad survey. The end purpose is not just to collect some baseline data about what's going on in terms of identifying these students, in terms of professional development for teachers and things like that, but also to identify programs, because we're also looking at kid outcomes for these various districts. And we're trying to figure out which districts in Texas are doing a particularly good job of working with gifted and talented students, and then trying to sort of highlight what's going on in those particular districts. So stay tuned. Probably have more to say in about a year.
So I think we have time for just one more question, and I'll open that up to both the first panel as well as this panel as well. Get the last question.
My name is Natalie. Oh, thank you. My name is Natalie, and I didn't hear a lot about cross-cultural collaboration, international work. Can you speak more about that because I'm sure there are assessments made in other languages across the world in other universities. And I wonder if you've sought that out and thought of integrating that for your work, your personal and professional work.
Yeah. Rebecca, you want to come up here? Or? There's a mic coming, yeah.
Oh, thank you. There are a number of assessments we use for gifted that have been translated, and they're often translated in other countries, and they're normed on monolingual Spanish-speaking populations in those other countries. So we have a number. The Woodcock Munoz is this fabulous instrument, but it doesn't necessarily match the language our students use here. So we have this other level of struggle in that they're bilinguals. Our kids are bilinguals, the two languages. So they're not monolingual Spanish speakers in that example or monolingual English speakers. And these instruments don't grasp that yet. We need to work more as a field on the development of instruments normed and piloted on bilingual populations. We are lacking very far behind in that. So.
Right. One of our colleagues who's not here, Patricia Gandara, has quite a bit of active work with Mexico and exchanging teachers and so forth. And so that's another effort. I'm sure if she were here, she would speak to it. So I think it's basically time for some socializing and over whatever, wine, cocktails, whatever they have available for us. I did want to once again thank our hosts and also to point out that we in the panels today we really addressed sort of standards and the access to the standards. We've talked about the training of teachers. There are many other areas around which we're doing work, assessment, overall sort of policy sorts of things, curriculum itself, and so forth. And so, and in a sense, language flows through all of that. And English learners are the students who are affected the most, even though, in fact, language sort of flows through all of it anyway for all students. But in a sense, the challenge of educating English learners is really bringing to the forefront sort of the role that language plays across sort of the different pieces of education. So I just want to leave you with that thought, and thank you very much.